The release of the Tsuyosa PRX a few years ago heralded a new age of affordable integrated bracelet watches. For a while, they dominated the market when it comes to the big brands, but there was another brand that kind of came out of nowhere with a release to compete with Tsuyosa, going toe to toe. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at a watch that is not actually mine. It's been lent into the channel by a friend of mine who bought it recently. So, big shout out to you. I know you're watching. It's a watch that most people have probably thought of buying at some point over the past 2 years, and upon release, some colours were hotter than others. The one here is a surprising pick, but might just be the best one. This is the Citizen Nj01050-81A, better known as the Citizen Tsuyosa. So, like I said, it's not mine, but I did think about buying one, in a specific colorway. But before I tell you which one, let's look at all of the available colors. Compared to when it was first released, there are quite a few more available. Initially, you could choose from black, green, yellow, light blue and dark blue. But since then, there has been this white one, as well as 2 different blue fume dials, a two-tone and a gold with red dial. However, none of these are the one I was considering. The one I almost bought, and maybe should have looking back, comes from their collaboration with Pantone, the Peaceful Green. Pantone is a company that graphic designers and other creatives will be familiar with, and are known for their work with colors. Each year, they'll choose a color of the year, and in collaboration with Citizen, chose 5 dial colors that all look pretty good, but the green was my pick. They are limited edition, and since have sold out anywhere that had them for a reasonable price, so I'll just have to admire them from afar. Since spending some time with this white dial, however, I can say that of all the regular production models, this white one is absolutely my favorite. If you saw some of my videos from earlier this year, you'll know that I was in Japan, and when there had a chance to look at pretty much all of the colors, so I can be pretty confident when I say this is my favorite. It's honestly an unexpected standout for me, and might even tempt me to get one of my own. Might. Here in Australia, these Tsuyosa models have an official retail price of between $650 to $750, depending on the color you choose. That's pretty high for what you get, and it seems other retailers agree, because you can regularly find these available for under $400, which converts to about $260 USD at the moment. That's pretty much in line with what I can see them available for in places like JomaShop and eBay, so internationally there seems to be some consistency in price. The other thing to note is that very recently there have also been leaks and announcements of a small seconds model, coming with a very intricately textured dial. Those will be interesting to keep an eye out for. One is even set to come on a leather strap, which might open up more options for people. So, since it's the dial that really won me over, let's get stuck into it and check it out. It's a stark white, a crisp white that you really don't see that often. It evokes images of a cool wintry day spent in a dentist's office with a mouthful of toothpaste. Okay, maybe I don't have a way with words like Andrew Morgan does, but you get the idea. It's a pure white rather than a warm white that you usually see on most watches. The surface of the dial is also glossy, which makes me think of something like the keys of the piano. The stock photos of this watch really sell that dial short, making it look very flat and one-dimensional. In person, it has much more depth and is very interesting. Around the dial, we have an array of rectangular applied batons. These have polished surrounds and the inside is filled with lume. At 12 and 6 there are double batons, and overall, the dial has more than a bit of an Oyster Perpetual vibe. Not that that's a bad thing. The symmetry is broken up a little, as the marker at 3 has been cut short to make way for what, on its own, is a pretty small date window. Thankfully, or unfortunately if you're in that camp, there's a Cyclops positioned directly above it on the crystal to magnify it. Around the outside of the markers, there is some printing for the minute track, and at each hour, these little squares which provide another little bit of lume. They may be a little redundant in terms of after dark viewing, but add a small detail to the design instead of lines for the minutes all the way around. The only other printing on the dial comes in the form of the brand logo above the pinion and the word automatic below. One thing to note is that the position of the brand logo is exactly halfway between the pinion and the top of the dial, rather than halfway between the pinion and the inner edge of the 12 o'clock marker. I spent some time inspecting the dial closely, and it was something that I noticed, but don't mind. There isn't a lot of printing on the dial, so having it a bit closer to the edge allows the center of the dial to breathe even more. There is enough going on that it doesn't feel empty, but does feel intentional. A small omission that I do actually appreciate is that there's nothing printed at the bottom of the dial, such as Made in Japan or the movement and case number. It keeps everything clean on a color that really embodies a clean and simple design. The vibes of the OP extend to the hands, where we have simple polished batons with loomed sections, and a bevel running down the middle to catch the light. I like the proportions that Citizen have gone here with the hands. The hour hand is just a little bit longer, reaching just short of the markers, and the minute hand reaches just short of the minute track. It could have been easy for the hands to be too small on this watch and get lost or make it difficult to read the time, but the hands manage legibility and visibility well. The seconds hand is a simple needle hand making its way around the dial once per minute. Covering all of that and holding onto that cyclops is of course the crystal. This presents another of the draws of this watch, with it being sapphire rather than mineral crystal. At the price these are generally available for, you won't be getting sapphire from most other big brands, so it's a big plus for the watch. It's completely flat, aside from the cyclops, and seems to have some anti-reflective coating that does a reasonable job. You probably know what to expect when it comes to the case, but let's go over it anyway. Framing the dial is this polished bezel that really likes to play with the light, especially outdoors. It's a pretty standard thing for a watch that's pitching itself as an everyday watch. The case is where it gets a little bit more interesting. In terms of measurements, we've got a 40mm case diameter, which is a pretty standard size to appeal to the masses. Thickness is quite good at just 11.9mm, and while lug-to-lug doesn't work exactly the same way on this watch, it measures 44.9 on just the case, and if you include the first link where it sticks out, 49.3mm. One other measurement that I think really affects the wearing of the watch, but don't see talked about as much, is the width of the bracelet as it leaves the case. What I find with a lot of these integrated bracelet watches is that the bracelet will be quite wide when it leaves the case, and results in the watch feeling larger on wrist. This Tsuyosa starts out at 22mm, but quickly tapers down to 18. I'm glad it tapers because I find myself really not liking 22mm as a strap width these days. There are some sharp, crisp lines making up this case. We've got that flat, vertically brushed top that angles downwards to form what are not quite lugs, but where the case connects to the bracelet. Those sharp horizontal lines work well to separate the watch into 3 segments. That brushed top transitions into polishing on the side of the case, with the help of a chamfer running the length of the case. The side is flat and creates a smooth curve running from top to bottom. Before getting to the case back, the case cuts in underneath itself, and I'm not a huge fan of that. It kind of works to make the head of the watch sit higher on the wrist and feel a bit top heavy. From the side, we can also see a crown which is in a slightly awkward spot. It's not quite at 4 o'clock, but rather at about 4:10, and being recessed into the case, while visually balancing things, makes it a bit tougher to wind or set the watch. Turning the watch over completely, we find ourselves looking straight at the movement thanks to the display caseback. This crystal too seems to be sapphire, which is a pleasant surprise. We get a look at the Miyota 8210 movement powering this watch. From what I've heard, there have been 2 versions of the Tsuyosa. Early models featured a movement that did not hack or hand wind, whereas later models, such as this one here, got a movement that does both of those things. It's a fairly basic movement, but does the job, and looks a little more interesting than the NH35 you see in many other watches. It's finally time to get to the bracelet part of this integrated bracelet watch. Better late than never, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, it starts off at 22mm before tapering to 18 at the clasp. The links are solid and feel reasonably nice. It's a 3-piece link with a flat underside and heavily curved top surface. The center link as well as the sides of the links are polished, while the outer 2 links are brushed. I would probably prefer all the links to be brushed, as I'm not a fan of polished center links, but they're not so noticeable in everyday use here. The links are quite short, which will allow you to get a good fit in combination with the 3 positions of micro adjustment on the clasp. The clasp, it must be said, is pretty average. It's probably the biggest weakness of the watch, but at the same time is something that can fairly easily be swapped out for something better. It's got a pressed scissor and outer shell, and the Citizen logo has been etched across it. It's been pretty comfortable in the time I've spent with it, and if you look carefully, there are actually some decently sized gaps in between each link. You won't see it when you're wearing it, but it might also help with comfort and breathability in hotter weather. Okay, it's that time of the video. Time to get it on wrist and see how it wears. One thing I like about this Tsuyosa compared to something like a PRX is that while having the same 40mm case size, the presence on wrist is not as big and makes it a bit more comfortable. Initially, I still felt that the shape made it look a little too big for my taste, but as I've spent more time with it, I have gotten used to it and don't really feel that way anymore. I have tried on a PRX and it definitely wears better than that. As I turn my wrist, you'll see that bezel catching the light, as well as hopefully what I was talking about earlier when I said that the case feels like it sits just a bit high on wrist. Overall, it is a very comfortable watch to wear and I have enjoyed it quite a lot. So, I've had a lot of good things to say about the watch, and I do like it quite a lot. However, it does have its shortcomings, which I've touched on a few times. That Cyclops can be a bit polarizing. I know my friend who loaned me this watch is planning to have it removed. I've seen some pictures of people that have removed theirs, and I will admit, it looks a lot cleaner. Another letdown is the cheap clasp, which thankfully can be easily fixed. The only other complaint I have is not exactly a complaint, and something that inherently comes with an integrated bracelet watch. No, it's not that you can't swap out the strap, it's that they tend to wear a bit larger than the case size. I personally would have preferred a 38mm size here, as I feel that would be my sweet spot. Citizen had a big opportunity in my opinion to fill in the big gap in the market that the PRX currently doesn't. With them, you have to either go 35 or 40mm, and for me, one is too small and the other too big. I'd like to see something in the middle, and Citizen could have done that, but instead they went with the same size as the Tsuyosa. So, while you do have more choice in terms of color and style, you don't have any more choices when it comes to size. That said, I don't think it's by any means too big or unwieldy, just a touch bigger than I'd like. That doesn't take away from the fact that it's a good looking solid watch for a reasonable price. It's not redefining what a luxury watch is, but it's not trying to, and I can appreciate that. What do you think about this watch? Do you have a Tsuyosa in your collection? Was yours the order that sent Peaceful Green out of stock? Have I missed that perfect 38mm watch from another brand? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.